In this video we are going to talk about Python lists. Lists are basically a sequence of elements or data. Using lists, we can, for example, store entire series of measurements in a single variable. We create a list by first giving a variable name that codes for the list, and then writing the elements of the list separated by commas within square brackets. When we print this list, we can see that all the elements we added are stored in the variable. Of course, this also works with letters, words, or even whole sentences that we can list. If we want to store such strings in a list, we need to remember to use quotation marks. I will start by adding some letters to the list to represent the string data type. Generally, you can store any data type in a list. This means we can mix different data types within a single list. For example, we can start with some numbers, then add another list as a single element, and finish the list with some strings. There's also a command that allows us to create a list iteratively, adding elements one by one without recreating the list each time. For this, I will use an already created list that I have filled with some fields of geography, and as we can see, this list doesn't contain all the fields that we have in geography. To add more elements, we call the existing list and add another element using the append command. If we want to add multiple elements at once, we need to use the extend command and list the elements to be added in their own list. In this case, I want to add the elements human and economic geography to the list that has already been extended with geomatics. The most important aspect of lists is probably indexing and list slicing. These techniques will come up frequently throughout the course. Indexing is essentially the targeted retrieval of elements from a list. I will now call the first entry from our existing list and store the selected element in its own variable. It is important to know that the indices of a list start at 0. This means that the first element in a list has an index of 0. The second has an index of 1, the third has an index of 2, and so on and so on. The index is simply the position in the list where the element is stored. So if I perform indexing with an index of 0, I get the string geomorphology. If I repeat the indexing with an index of 1, I get the second entry in my list. But if I want to retrieve multiple elements from the list at once, I use list slicing. Python will then return not just a single element, but a list of the queried elements. Let's start by selecting the first two elements. The slicing, like indexing, is written in square brackets. This time, however, we use the expression colon2. Using a colon before the index, in this case 2, means that Python returns all elements up to that index. The specified index, however, is not inclusive. So this expression means select the elements with indices 0 and 1. When I execute this, I get a small list containing the elements at those positions. Conversely, we can also select from a certain index onwards by placing the colon after the index. Selecting from an index is inclusive in this case, meaning all entries from the specified index onwards are selected. So the entries with indices 2, 3, 4, and 5 are selected in this case, meaning pedology, geomatics, human geography, and economic geography are selected. These two selection methods, select up to and select from, can be combined to query entries from the middle of a list. For instance, the value from the first index up to but not including the third index. In this case, they are the strings biogeography and pedology. Often we don't know the length of our list, so we might not know the index of the last element. Selecting the very last entry can be tricky because we don't know which index to query. There's an easy solution for this problem using a specific predefined index. If we perform indexing with the value -1, Python knows we want to query the last element. In our case, the last element is economic geography. Now let's move to a slightly more complicated topic: nested lists. As we saw earlier, lists can exist within a list. The question now is, how do we query a value from within a nested list? It's a bit more complex, but not too difficult. I will use a list that I created earlier from which we can start. As you can see, I've written the individual lists under each other within the main list for better readability. Though it's not strictly necessary to structure the nested list like this. When using this formatting, make sure to get the tab stop right, because Python is a bit picky about it. Now I want to query the second entry from my list. The second entry is this second list, which has an index of 1. We start by querying this list just like we did with the strings of the field of geography earlier. So I call the list and specify index 1. Executing this returns the second list, the element with index 1. This list has its own elements, numbers in this case, which I can again select. To retrieve the last element from this list, I can use the current selection, stored in variable second entry, and get the last element using the index -1. This whole multi-level selection process can also be shortened into a single line of code. From my nested list, I want to get the first element, and then perform another selection for the element at index 2. This way I can chain queries together and get the desired element.